Welcome to Next in Tech, an S&P Global Market Intelligence podcast where the world of emerging tech lives. I'm your host, Eric Hanselman, Chief Analyst for Technology, Media, and Telecom at S&P Global Market Intelligence. And as we roll into the end of the year and the holiday shopping season is upon us, our thoughts turn to the technology that sits underneath it all. And back on the podcast to discuss it with me is Sheryl Kingstone, who heads up our customer experience technology research team. Sheryl, welcome back.
Thank you, Eric. I always love participating in these things.
Well, this is so topical and seasonal. And also, when we start thinking about the tech that is sitting underneath all of this, there is a lot that is going on with the customer experience side of things. And granted, as
Absolutely.
shopping activity increases, there's certainly a lot more interaction on a personal basis. But there's a lot that we've been seeing in the data behind this about really what's going on with customer experience and what organizations are doing as they try and make sense of interacting with customers.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So we constantly speak to businesses, retailers, and consumers on where their attitudes are with respect to consumer spending, right? And then we tie that to what businesses can do to make sure that they're meeting those customer expectations, especially now that we've had this huge shift to digital. So we've been talking about digital for 2 decades. Cloud shifts with infrastructure changes, with e-commerce launches. And e-commerce is still a small part of the overall GDP pie, right? But when we do take a look at the growth of e-commerce that just skyrocketed during COVID, then we want to take a look to see where is it staying? How is it going? And everyone wants to know what's coming up with this holiday shopping season.
Well, this is the first time that we're really into that. Again, I'm always cautious saying post-pandemic, but this real season in which we've had a chance for people to be able to move back to the way in which their preferences are driving them to interact with retail. And there's that hope that digital has taken a stronghold. But I think a lot of retailers and certainly a lot of the tech that powers them are really waiting to see where that goes.
Absolutely. And so our data did come back, and shopping online this upcoming holiday season is beating out in-store by 10 points, right?
All
So
right.
that's huge.
Yep.
That's huge. Even on old folks like us, I know this is a podcast and no visuals, but even over 40% of the 55 plus age groups are shopping online.
So this is one of the things you talked about in earlier studies. The big concern was there was this desire to go back to in-person. And the question was, would that actually displace that online activity altogether? Sounds like the answer is not completely. And
not completely. Yeah. So it's going to stay there. We've seen an increase. But here's the thing I want people to realize is that digital experiences are now also in store, right? While we don't really probe on that too much in the holiday realm, the ones that are shopping in store are going to big box retailers like Best Buy and Walmart and Target. And they really want to use and understand digitally as where we can potentially embrace that. So Best Buy, I know, has made a lot of investments in technology. So has Walmart. And so the real question is, what are they doing to improve and make their store a little bit more digital? And I don't really see that coming out yet. Maybe next year, we'll be able to understand the role of the digital store in store. But today, it really is all about what are we going to do to improve the online experience in that digital world.
well, we've talked about omnichannel and the idea that you have to be able to work with customers wherever they are, however they're interacting, and the ability to be able to ensure that they've got a at least relatively seamless transition between these various modes. It sounds like what's happening is that transition at least hasn't extended all the way out to the in-person experience yet, but more of that
Except for maybe
digitization.
pickup, right?
Huh?
If there's a handful of companies that are actually doing really well. A lot of companies braced buy online, pick up in store, right? So that's a given. The whole BOPIS type of approach is there, and it's going to stay. What I do think we need to take a look at in store is how are we doing inventory lookup easier? How are we allowing the consumer to get product information online? We're doing a lot better job, in store. We're doing a lot better job of that online than we are in store. And so when we look at what consumers are looking to improve for their holiday spending, things like better search capabilities, that's not going to transition into the online area as well. But they're also looking for detailed product information and specs, measurements that will review. What about product reviews and ratings? If we really think about that flexible shopping experience, that really comes next, right? The ability to cross online and in store. But so does a lot of the research coming about. So this is where you could have product reviews even in store. If you're putting it online, put it on in store, right? Try to make sure that it's as interactive as possible.
It sounds like that's really a displacement of some of the ideas about in-store digital capabilities that we'd looked at historically. There was that whole push towards digital pricing, and you could maybe do dynamic pricing in store. Was really something was maybe driven by the retailer side. But it seems like the shift is moving towards customer-centric focus and blending that online experience for things like reviews, so that when you're faced with a wall of toasters, which ones are more highly rated, and those things that you could do online to be able to actually do in the in-person experience as well.
Absolutely. So our data shows to improve that in-store holiday shopping experience, it is about the number one thing is the ability to check inventory online before going to the store. Right after that is the ability to redeem exclusive in-store promotions and rewards, understanding out of stock inventory and have it shipped to home. Those are your top three digital experiences. Right below that is around the ability to pay and interact with a sales associate. Fast and convenient payment options. And a lot of this is absolutely really critical because there's functionality that goes across in store and online.
I could imagine payment again. How many pictures of long checkout lines have you seen? Payment winds up becoming a really critical piece in order to ensure that you've got, again, that next step in the customer experience that's as smooth and simple as possible.
Absolutely.
Well, it was interesting. Jordan McKee was on just before this talking about some of
Yeah.
those innovations. So this dovetails nicely with that. I think a lot of the things that Jordan was talking about, the challenge is translating those into the in-store experience, because that winds up being, hey, online, you've got lots of different options that are presented to you. But in store,
Not so many.
there's that register and that's about it. So
Yeah. And we actually calculated that lack of preferred payment friction is around a $27 billion revenue loss potential just in 6 months.
ooh, ouch. That's the holy cow, this line is really long. I don't have any other options. Forget it. I'm just going to go order it online. That sort of
Yeah.
thing. Yeah. And then, of course, once that shift away from the buying opportunity happens, potentially lost that sale. Well, it sounds like there's also friction on the online side of things. And some of that I guess maybe some opportunities to be able to do more in online experience.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I just talked about things like search criteria, that's one, right? When you can really make sure that you're resolving so that there's too many steps between discovery and purchase. So we calculated that whole friction point across that buying experience to be $31 billion, right? So that's huge. But if we think about too many steps, there's also a lack of performance, right? So a lot of companies aren't necessarily making sure that the site is responsive. So it's not just about search, but it's the overall performance that they're also achieving. And we see that like over 30, maybe sometimes even 60%, if you're adding up the two top box, will not go back to that site because of performance related issues. And so that's really where we can start understanding how to tie where we want to improve the experience, like from search, detailed product reviews. But how is that playing out in the underlying infrastructure? And where investments are you giving them as it relates to how are you managing the content? How are you making things much more personalized? What is the underlying infrastructure that's driving that website? All of this really plays out into friction points or revenue gains that can be parlayed during this upcoming holiday season.
But that was the interesting thing that I thought that came out of a lot of the data is that you're identifying opportunities lost, things like the friction side of things. But you also identified a set of opportunities where there's potential revenue gain. There are upsides that you can actually pick up in terms of things that you could invest in to be able to bring to that online experience that would actually generate greater sales.
Absolutely. So, revenue gains, let's look at the one I discussed, which was the whole loyalty reward or discount, redemption, and a lot of that. Well, $30 billion incremental purchase due to a loyalty reward or redemption discount. That's potentially an increase of where you would go. So you're driving more of that share of wallet because of the fact that you have information about that customer. You can make that loyalty reward appropriate because no one wants to throw a discount just to be a discount sake. If someone's going to already buy something, you don't want to necessarily throw a discount with them. And that's what we're doing. We're looking at things holistically instead of really using the technology to help us understand what is the right discount, who is the VIP that we want to target, and then how can I drive incremental revenue to do it right. Another way of looking at that also is what are we doing to improve cross-sell and upsell on personalized recommendations? Because we saw another $13 billion in just cross-sell and personalization. All of this requires a variety of different technologies under the hood to make it accurate, to make it effective. Everything from, again, more of that unified view of the profile to understand where the past purchases and products, where are your business objectives going from a retailer? What's your potential inventory levels? Because where we're seeing these personalized recommendations is great, but if you don't have the data in real time, that's where you're going to get into more of your revenue lost. Think about advertising discrepancies. How many times, Eric, have you gotten an email for an advertising on something you might want to buy? You click through it. It didn't necessarily bring you to that product. And on top of it, that product was out of stock or the product was priced differently. That ties down to you need to have the right information at the right time given to the right product so that you can personalize and cross-sell at the same time.
Well, it gets back to that whole issue of ensuring that you have sufficient data that is able to work across that entire infrastructure of interaction with the customer and ensure that whole process is clear and accurate. Because again, to your point, if you're shopping for one thing, you all of a sudden start getting coupons for something that's totally unrelated or uninterested, the opportunity is not necessarily going to be great. But if you can incentivize a customer to buy one more thing to gain an extra reward or something of that nature, then you've got the opportunity to drive an incremental sale that you didn't necessarily have. You're not giving away more value than for those customers that are already committed, but you maybe move that interaction a little further on. You offer up something in a cross-selling perspective that they can get to, but you've got to do that, or in order to accomplish that, you have to have a level of sophistication in terms of understanding what your current inventories are, that whole buying history. You have to have sufficiently accurate recommendations for what people should be buying or what they would be interested in buying. And for many, that's a challenge. That's a level of infrastructure they really haven't gotten to in terms of digitization. And in the past, you've identified the challenge that many face because you've got multiple different paths of interaction with the customer, and they're not always coordinated. So if they went into the store and bought something, that may not be linked to online activity. If they're in online, they may not see it in store. Those sorts of things that you've really got to ensure that there's unification across these engagement points.
And the last huge revenue to add up to this $250 billion worth of opportunity here that we've been discussing, 30 billion in cross-channel buying options in store and online. That's what we started talking about. But if done effectively, you can really drive revenue gains.
And that's the make sure that what you did in person, in store, and online are fully synced up.
Absolutely. Right. And so the good news is it is available. We can do this. Consumers are spending, right? So you want to make sure you're targeting your right consumers. Granted, it's only a slight increase from average spending last year. We can calculate the average consumer is going to spend around $612 this year versus last year wasn't 600. So it's not like we're going to, your share of wallet's going to grow. So what is your competition doing to get more of that share of wallet than last year? Because everything's pretty flat.
And so, well, that means the competition is all that much more fierce and the edge in digitization can be that much more meaningful.
Yeah. Now, one thing we didn't talk about that I keep forgetting to point out is when we do talk about where they're shopping this year, this holiday, what was a little different though, is the fact that Gen Zs actually were behaving slightly different than their older counterparts, right? So when I talked about big box retailers, Best Buy, Walmart, Target, all of that, right? The younger generation is actually looking to buy more from local, from pop-up shops, and they're also looking to go direct to consumer. And so, well, it might be hard to understand what are the mom and pops doing to empower their tech spending, but a lot of them are really embracing the digital. They have technology, there's services out there that they've embraced, but the direct to consumer is very interesting because it adds some complexity for businesses that don't really want to sell directly online, but want to sell through retailers. And so it really will be interesting to watch the growth of something I call embedded commerce, where we're starting to really hopefully bring the ecosystem together, even when the brands might not be selling direct to consumer anyway, even though we talk about going direct to consumer. So let me clarify, some might, like a Nike, they have stores, they have online. But like L'Oreal would prefer and doesn't want to instigate some channel partners, think Rite Aid, CVS, right? So as they go direct to consumer, they want to embrace that embedded commerce experience to show all the retailers where you could get that information. That's just another way of looking at it, especially in a younger generation that's going to start requiring all of this technology to be at their fingertips.
Well, it seems like one of those things that if your path to market is a relatively complicated channel, now you've got to be able to navigate how you both engage directly with consumers and then get those consumers directed into the appropriate channel based on what you're actually trying to sell them, how you're trying to get to them. That sounds like a real challenge.
Well, it's a challenge, but it is something that a lot of major brands are trying to do because they want the data, right? They don't necessarily want to disintermediate their ecosystem, but they do want the data on the consumers.
And that then means that they've got to link to their sales channels.
Yes.
And try and close that loop. And whether or not that happens to be coupons, discounts that are going to actually ring through to them after that sale actually happens. That's traditionally been a path that's a little more complicated because in closing that loop through that end retailer, you've got that extra step, that extra journey you've got to make in order to get that data back.
Correct. So, we
more they got to do.
Year will be.
Well, it's especially when we're in an environment in which that direct consumer has so many different paths. You've got the rising influence of influencers as part of that selling channel. You've now got all of that next stage of potential integration of selling that's taking place. There are a lot of things that retailers have to be juggling in terms of ensuring that they've got visibility and some level of sufficient insight that they can take away from all of these positions. I mean, that's
correct.
Bit of a Bit of a
Yeah,
challenge.
it is a bit of a challenge. And let's add in the fact that social isn't going away. So consumers are on social. So how are we going to make sure that you're there, you're embedding in their social channels, and you're making that social channel shoppable? And to be honest with you, this is where some of the smaller businesses have succeeded. They are able to make that embedded in the top channels, believe it or not, are Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, right? So that's where they're discovering and researching their products. Now, how are we making sure that it's shoppable there so that you do enable that one-click checkout?
And that you can convert. And hey, again, if you've got direct consumer, it's
Yeah,
pretty straightforward. But if you're trying to drive channel, then you've got to
not
ensure
so
that you're
much.
pushing people to those products.
Yes.
Well, it is something, though, that a lot of big brands are out there working with that influencer community. It seems in many cases they don't necessarily have the full feedback as to what that success rate is. They'll have some level of click through. I think all the major social media channels now have got some level of sell through capability. They need, from the retailer's perspective, you've actually got to ensure that you've actually got the ability to capture that information and then actually do something meaningful with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Because there is a very strong trend for really embracing that, not only the influencers, but the user generated content, right? So when we do take a look at digitally driven organizations, yes, they're spending it on digital advertising and they're increasing it. But large proportion of them, 72%, are incorporating more user generated content just to improve their brand authenticity. So now, how are you closing the loop on using that content, right? A lot of this is really where things are going to come forward about what I have been referring to and will be talking about a lot in this 2024 season is how are we embracing our content supply chain so that we're able to embed content in a more contextual way across all the different platforms. How are we using our earned content, user generated content, to improve our authenticity? And then how are we leveraging that 360-degree view to improve everything as a foundation?
Ooh, that sounds like things that in the year ahead,
Yeah.
there is interesting perspectives. It sounds like for the retail channel, these are areas in which organizations need to get back to the fundamentals. They need to have an understanding about what their data infrastructure looks like to feed this. They've got to understand what that full set of channel integrations have to look like. And I don't know, are there pieces I'm missing there in terms of what they should be looking at for the year ahead while they're in the midst of this crazy holiday season?
Well, I hate to do this, Eric. I really do. But we have to understand where the future is going for generative AI, right? We've been talking about this over and over
Whoa,
and
we
over
were able to,
again.
we almost made it all the way through without bringing up AI, but no.
We almost made it, and I knew you would do it. And I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why. Because businesses are really looking for generative AI across most of the customer facing departments. So we're there, the businesses that are currently using it and evaluating it, this is where they're going: marketing, sales, product development, and customer service, right? That's really the top spend for generative AI. So what does that mean? That means, how are we going to use the content? How are we going to use some of the text generation? How are we going to put in the infrastructure and the privacy in place so that we're able to truly create some of these experiences that are going to really help scale these departments, is what it's all about.
Well, it's doing the thing that AI does well, which is bringing together a whole set of dissimilar pieces of information and being able to synthesize some useful interactions that are driven by that. And hey, it's an investment, but it's one that used appropriately can help to solve a lot of these problems of making sense of, that whole issue of we've got lots of data in lots of different places. How do we integrate it? How do we actually come up with meaningful results out of it?
Absolutely. And if you aggregate it all up, the number one use case that most businesses are really interested in, when you take into account they're not really doing anything yet, but want to type. Customer service and support, right? So what are we doing to help really improve? And this is huge. How frustrated we get by a lot of companies that aren't answering our questions properly, that aren't answering quickly enough, that aren't in the right channel for me because they can't scale. They don't have the information. And that's really where we can use a combination of predictive artificial intelligence and generative artificial intelligence to really change the game on customer service and support.
Well, and it starts to deliver those things that you were focused on at the outset, which is being able to work with customers however they want to interact and being able to span them in ways that will carry over those conversations from whatever environment they start to work it out, whether or not it's chat to begin with, in store where they can actually find somebody who has some clue what they're actually looking for. All these back and forths, that the extent to which they can smooth that transition and deliver more information that is meaningful to that customer, the more successful they're going to be. Well, we will have to see how this season happens to turn out. Clearly, we're in the midst of it right now, but maybe post-season, Sheryl, we'll bring you back and talk about some of where this has actually all gotten to.
Absolutely. And I do hope that everyone's planning for a fabulous Black Friday because I personally want to be able to do some shopping. I am looking for those discounts and I want to make sure that I can find what I want quickly and then check out with one click. So we'll see how that really happens.
Well, we'll have some personal anecdotes to share about how successful or the shopping season happened to be.
Yeah.
Well, we will be right in the midst of all of this when this episode airs, so we will see. But thank you for all the information, Sheryl. I will point our listeners to your study results and some of the things that they can look at to be able to improve their digital shopping experience for their customers and take a look at where this ought to be headed.
Thank you, Eric, for having me. And if anyone wants all this information, we're publishing it very shortly, so stay tuned.
Great. Well, and that is it for this episode. We are at time. Thanks to our audience for staying with us. And thanks to our production team, including Carolyn Wright, Caitlin Buckley on the marketing and events teams, and our agency partner, the 199. I hope you'll join us for our next episode, where we will be once again drifting back into artificial intelligence, this time from a security perspective. I hope you'll join us then, because there is always something next in tech.